Have you ever witnessed a moment so shocking that it turned a loud, rowdy bar into complete silence? 1 second, the jukebox is playing, glasses are clinking, laughter is echoing, and the next, every single eye in the room is frozen on one man who just made the biggest mistake of his life. Why? Because he thought humiliating a waitress in front of everyone would make him look tough. But the second he ripped her shirt, what he revealed underneath didn't just change the night. It exposed a truth that nobody in that bar would ever forget. If you've ever seen arrogance get destroyed in the most unexpected way, then you're going to love this story. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this video from? Now let S dive into what happened when one biker S cruelty met the truth he never saw coming. The night began like any other in that small-town bar, the kind of place where neon beer signs buzz faintly against wood-paneled walls and the jukebox in the corner struggles to play the same old country tracks without skipping. The air smelled of fried food, spilled beer, and the faint trace of cigarette smoke that clung to the regulars' leather jackets. It wasn't a fancy place, just a working-class hangout where truckers, bikers, and locals all collided at the end of a long week. Behind the counter and weaving between tables was Sarah, the waitress who had worked there longer than most of the patrons had been drinking. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't loud. But she carried herself with the kind of quiet resilience that made people notice her without her saying a word. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, her shirt clean but faded, her smile polite but never forced. Every move she made was efficient, practiced, balancing trays, dodging elbows, keeping the peace when conversations grew heated. She wasn't just serving drinks, she was holding the place together. And that night, the bar was packed. A local biker group had rolled in, filling the booths with their leather vests and booming voices. Most of them were loud but harmless, laughing, playing pool, ordering round after round. But one of them stood out immediately, not because he was bigger, but because of the way he carried himself. Arrogance radiated off him like heat from a fire. He slammed his beer down harder than he needed to. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes. And every time Sarah passed by, his eyes followed her, not with admiration, but with something uglier. At first, it was little things. A crude comment slipped under his breath when she turned her back, a hand that lingered too close when she set down his drink, a chuckle that made the guys at his table look around, waiting for the next performance. Sarah, professional as always, ignored him. She had dealt with men like this before, men who mistook her politeness for weakness. But the more she brushed him off, the more determined he seemed to get. By the third round of drinks, he wasn't whispering anymore. He was calling her sweetheart, loud enough for the whole bar to hear. He was making bets with his friends about how long it would take to make her blush. Each time Sarah walked away, she could feel the heat of his gaze burning into her back. And then it happened. The moment that would silence the bar and set the stage for everything that followed. Sarah bent down to collect empty glasses from his table, her tray balanced against her hip. Without warning, the biker shot out his hand, grabbed the edge of her shirt, and with one vicious tug, ripped it straight down the front. The sound of fabric tearing was sharp enough to slice through the jukebox music. The tray of glasses tilted dangerously in Sarah's hands. And for a single, suspended heartbeat, the entire bar went silent, everyone's eyes snapping toward the scene that no one could believe they were actually witnessing. For a second, it was as if time itself stopped. The jukebox crackled, the pool balls lay scattered mid-game, and even the ceiling fan seemed to slow in its lazy spin. Sarah stood frozen, her hands trembling as the tray of half-empty glasses rattled like nervous teeth in a jaw. Her shirt hung open in jagged shreds, exposing more than she ever intended to show, not just of skin but of her dignity, her privacy, her humanity. She clutched at herself instinctively, her face pale, her lips trembling as her eyes darted around the room. And that's when it happened. Every head in the bar turned, not just toward Sarah, but toward him. the biker who sat there with a smug grin spreading across his face, like he had just pulled the greatest joke in the world. He leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide in mock innocence, as if to say, "What? I was just having fun." The other bikers at his table let out awkward laughs, the kind that weren't born from humor, but from fear. Fear of breaking the tension, fear of challenging the unspoken code. The silence was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. Even the regulars, the men who usually wouldn't lift their heads from their beers, stared in disbelief. A waitress' shirt ripped off in the middle of a crowded bar, it wasn't just wrong. It was a violation so bold, so deliberate, that it left people stunned into stillness. Sarah's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She wasn't weak. She had worked in this bar long enough to know how to survive men with wandering hands and loose tongues. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. This was about humiliation. This was about being reduced to nothing more than a spectacle, an object of mockery in front of everyone she had ever served. And the worst part? The biker's grin only grew wider as he looked around the room, as if waiting for applause, waiting for validation, waiting for someone to join in the cruelty. His fingers still toyed with the shredded edge of fabric, like a cat pawing at the remains of a mouse it had just killed. The silence stretched on, and in that moment, Sarah's breath came shallow, her chest heaving with both fear and fury. Her mind screamed at her to run, to flee into the back room, to hide from the dozen sets of eyes fixed on her. But her feet were rooted to the spot, trapped between the weight of shame and the iron grip of rage building in her gut. And then, like a spark in dry grass, the mood shifted. Someone coughed, sharp and deliberate, breaking the spell. A chair scraped against the floor, slow, deliberate, like the dragging of a blade across stone. All eyes swiveled again, this time not toward Sarah, not toward the grinning biker, but toward the figure rising from a shadowed corner of the bar. No one knew it yet, but the man who stood at that moment would change everything. The chair legs groaned against the wooden floor, slow and deliberate, like the warning growl of an animal about to strike. Every head turned to see the figure rising from the corner booth, a man who until now had been just another shadow in the dimly lit bar. He wasn't the biggest in the room, not by a long shot, but there was something in the way he moved, measured, unhurried, coiled with the kind of quiet confidence that made the air itself tighten. He stood tall, his jacket falling open to reveal a plain black t-shirt stretched over a broad chest. His hands, scarred, calloused, the kind of hands that had known both labor and violence, rested easily at his sides. His face was weathered, the kind that carried more stories than he would ever speak aloud. But it wasn't the scars or the stubble that silenced the room. It was his eyes, steady, cold, fixed on the biker with the shredded shirt in his hand. The biker's grin faltered, just a crack, like glass under pressure. He shifted in his seat, trying to mask it with a chuckle. "What? You got something to say, old man?" His voice was still loud, still cocky, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that betrayed a sliver of doubt. The stranger didn't answer. Not yet. He simply walked forward, each step echoing louder than the jukebox, louder than the whispers, louder than the heartbeat thundering in Sarah's chest. The other bikers tensed, their hands twitching toward bottles, toward pockets, toward anything that might become a weapon if things went bad. But the stranger's calm was disarming, unsettling, the kind of calm that belonged to men who didn't bluff. Sarah stood frozen, her arms clutching the torn edges of her shirt, her eyes darting between the man who had humiliated her and the one now stepping into the fire. She didn't know him. None of them did. But the moment he locked eyes with her, just for an instant, she felt something she hadn't felt since the fabric ripped apart. Safety. The biker leaned back, forcing a laugh, trying to reclaim his stage. "Hey, relax, cowboy. We were just having a little fun." No harm done, right? He gestured toward Sarah with a smirk that dripped with mockery. She's a tough girl. She can take a joke. That's when the stranger spoke. His voice was low, steady, and so calm, it sent a chill through every spine in the room. That wasn't a joke. The words dropped like a hammer, heavy and final. No yelling, no threats, just the kind of truth that stripped away all excuses. The laughter from the biker's table died instantly, replaced with an uneasy silence. The bar no longer felt like a bar. It felt like a battlefield waiting for the first shot. And in that charged silence, everyone knew one thing for certain. The night had just changed forever. The biker's smirk flickered, and for the first time since the night began, he looked uncertain. His buddies shifted in their seats, their earlier bravado slipping into restless glances. No one liked the silence. It was the kind that weighed heavy, the kind that suggested something was about to break. The stranger didn't move fast. He didn't need to. He stepped closer until he stood between Sarah and the biker, his body a barrier, his presence a wall the biker couldn't bulldoze through with cheap intimidation. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't need to. The sheer gravity of his composure was enough to make everyone wonder what kind of man they were really dealing with. The biker pushed back his chair, metal screeching against wood, trying to reassert his dominance. He puffed up his chest, squaring off with the man who had dared to challenge him. "Look, old-timer," he sneered, trying to inject venom into his voice. "Why don't you mind your business before you get hurt? This ain't your fight." The stranger tilted his head slightly, like he was studying a puzzle. His jaw tightened, his eyes never blinking. Then, with a voice calm enough to be terrifying, he replied, "It became my fight the moment you touched her." The bar went still. The sound of a beer bottle rolling off the counter and shattering on the floor was the only thing that broke the silence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the remains of her shirt tighter, her eyes wide, as though she couldn't quite believe someone was standing up for her, someone who owed her nothing. The biker scoffed, trying to shake the chill creeping up his spine. He swung his arm wide, pointing toward the door. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're not walking out of here in one piece if you keep running your mouth?" But the stranger didn't back down. Instead, he leaned forward ever so slightly, his words cutting like a blade. "I've walked out of worse." The weight of those 5 words sent a ripple through the room. People exchanged nervous looks. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they were about to see their friend humbled or destroyed. The biker, desperate to save face, shoved the stranger hard in the chest. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Chairs scraped as people stood, anticipating chaos. Sarah gasped, half expecting the stranger to stumble back, maybe even retreat. But he didn't move. Not an inch. The biker's smirk melted completely now, replaced with something raw. Fear. His shove hadn't even budged the man. The stranger just stood there, unshaken, unbreakable, his eyes locked like steel on his opponent. And that's when the room understood. This wasn't a fight about pride anymore. It wasn't a show of strength. This was something much deeper, something far more dangerous. The storm had arrived, and it was about to break. The shove should have marked the beginning of the fight. The biker expected the man to swing back, fists flying, chaos erupting. That's how bar brawls usually went, loud, messy, and forgettable. But what happened next wasn't loud. It was terrifyingly quiet. The stranger's hand shot out, not with a wild punch, but with precision. He caught the biker's wrist mid-air, holding it in a vice-like grip. The biker tried to yank free, but his face twisted in shock. It was as though steel cables had wrapped around his arm. A hush fell over the room, every eye locked on the impossible sight. The loudest man in the bar suddenly powerless, pinned by nothing more than a single steady hand. "You don't put your hands on women," the stranger said, voice steady, each word sharp enough to cut. His tone wasn't raised, but it carried more weight than a scream. It was the sound of a man who had lived those words, who had seen what happened when people forgot them. The biker, red-faced, snarled and swung his free fist, but the stranger shifted just enough for it to slice through air. Then, with the same calm control, he twisted the man's wrist, forcing him down onto one knee. The entire bar gasped. For the first time, the biker's gang looked unsettled. Sarah's eyes widened. She had seen plenty of drunk fights in this bar, but this wasn't a fight. This was a lesson. The biker roared, more out of humiliation than pain, and the stranger finally let him go. The man stumbled back, clutching his wrist, glaring up with hate, but unable to hide the fear now crawling across his face. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his voice cracking under the weight of his own shaken pride. "I've got brothers. This whole bar'll burn before I back down." The stranger took one step forward, just one, and the biker froze like a cornered animal. "You've already backed down," the stranger said softly. The crowd murmured, a ripple of disbelief and awe rolling through the bar. Even the biker's friends exchanged nervous looks, their earlier smirks gone. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. What was once dominance now looked like desperation, then something unexpected. Sarah, trembling but resolute, spoke. "Stop," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "This isn't just about me. It's about every night I've come here wondering if I was safe, about every woman you've treated like she doesn't matter." Her words cracked through the air like a whip, and for the first time, the biker's bravado shattered completely. His eyes darted around, desperate for support, but none of his friends spoke. None stepped forward. The stranger didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply turned slightly, positioning himself beside Sarah, not in front of her, as if saying, "This is your moment now." The biker stumbled back toward the door, muttering curses that no one believed. He left with his pride in tatters, and his gang followed quietly behind. But the silence they left behind wasn't empty. It was electric. Something had shifted forever. The bar had just witnessed more than a fight. It had witnessed a reckoning. The bar was silent in the wake of the storm. Glasses that had clinked just moments before sat untouched. Even the jukebox, still humming faintly in the background, seemed muted beneath the weight of what had just unfolded. Every single person was replaying the same thought. Who was this man? Sarah stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly, eyes wide, as she tried to process the fact that the biker, the man who had taunted, humiliated, and tried to strip her dignity away, had just been humbled in front of everyone. By a stranger who hadn't even raised his voice. The man released a slow breath, his eyes softening now that the immediate danger was gone. He turned to Sarah, and in that small moment, the contrast between the brutal force he had just wielded and the quiet kindness in his gaze nearly brought her to tears. "You okay?" he asked. Simple words, no theatrics, no demand for praise, just genuine concern. Sarah nodded shakily, but the room wasn't done with him. "Hey, man," one of the regulars finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. What are you? Some kind of fighter?" The man hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. For a moment, it looked like he would brush the question aside, but then, almost reluctantly, he said, "Marine. Retired." The words landed with the force of a hammer. A collective murmur spread across the bar, people exchanging looks of shock and respect. And suddenly, the image clicked. The precision, the control, the unshakable calm in the face of chaos. He hadn't just fought. He had trained for this, lived through far worse than a barroom brawl. Sarah blinked, her throat tight. "That's why," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. That's why he had stood so still. That's why the biker hadn't stood a chance. The man shrugged off the revelation as though it was no big deal. "I just don't like bullies," he said quietly, reaching for his drink like nothing extraordinary had happened. But to everyone else in that room, everything had changed. One by one, the regulars lifted their glasses, not in the usual rowdy way, but solemnly, respectfully, a silent toast. The biker's absence left behind something strange and rare in that smoky bar: hope. Sarah could feel it like a pulse in her chest. For the first time in years of serving cheap whiskey and fending off crude jokes, she felt like someone had reminded this room of its humanity. The man didn't bask in the glory. He didn't stand tall like a hero waiting for applause. He sat quietly, staring into his glass, as if the ghosts of his past still lingered heavier than the present cheers. And yet Sarah knew, so did everyone, that they had just witnessed a man whose scars, both seen and unseen, had turned into strength. The kind of strength that changes more than just a single night. The kind of strength that rewrites stories. The days after the fight carried a strange stillness, almost as though the little bar itself was holding its breath. Word spread quickly, too quickly for Sarah to keep up with. By the end of the week, she noticed unfamiliar faces slipping onto stools, people who whispered, "This the place?" before ordering a drink. They had heard about that night, about the biker who thought he owned the room, and the stranger who shattered him with nothing more than calm authority. For Sarah, the story wasn't about fists or fear. It was about the moment that man had turned to her, looked into her eyes not as if she were just a waitress, but as if she mattered. That look stayed with her. It stirred something that had been buried under years of exhaustion and dismissal. She realized with aching clarity that dignity wasn't a gift given by others. It was something she already owned. And that stranger had reminded her. The biker never came back. Maybe he was too humiliated. Maybe he finally realized that his reputation for toughness meant nothing against true strength. But the mark he left wasn't in his destruction. It was in the way his failure forced people to see Sarah differently. Customers who once threw careless comments now softened their tone, adding "thank you" and even offering a smile. The bar felt less like a battlefield and more like a gathering place again. And the stranger? He vanished just as quietly as he had appeared. No name, no number. Just that one night and those 3 words he left behind. "I don't like bullies." Sarah replayed them constantly, not because they were dramatic, but because they were so achingly simple. In a world where people often turned a blind eye, he had acted. He had reminded them all what courage looked like. But life has a way of rewarding quiet acts of sacrifice. Months later, Sarah received a letter in the mail. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from him. He wrote that he was moving to another state, that he didn't expect to return, but he wanted her to know something. "You stood tall that night too. Don't ever forget that." Inside the envelope was something else. A recommendation letter, signed and sealed by someone far higher than she could have imagined. He hadn't just been a Marine. He had been a decorated officer. And his words carried weight. Enough weight to open doors Sarah never thought possible. Tears blurred her vision as she read the last line. Sometimes life gives us scars, but sometimes it gives us people who help us carry them. Thank you for reminding me of that. That night at the bar was no longer just a story of humiliation or violence. It became a story of awakening, of dignity rediscovered, of humanity remembered. And for Sarah, it was the night she stopped being invisible. Because sometimes a single stranger doesn't just save you, they change you, forever. When you strip this story down, it isn't about a fight in a bar. It isn't about a biker who thought he could intimidate a waitress. It's about something deeper, something universal. It's about the people the world overlooks, the ones dismissed as just a waitress, just a worker, just someone without power. And it's about how, sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, Life reminds us that respect is not a privilege handed down by the arrogant. It's a right earned by simply being human. Sarah's story is a mirror for anyone who's ever felt invisible, forgotten, or disrespected. The Marine didn't just defend her dignity, he showed her, and everyone watching, that courage doesn't need a spotlight. True strength doesn't scream. It acts, quietly, powerfully, unforgettably. And maybe that's the lesson we all need. That kindness and bravery, small acts, decisive acts, can ripple out further than fists, further than fear. If this story gave you chills, if it stirred something inside you, don't let it end here. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what is the most powerful moment of quiet courage you've ever witnessed? Because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders of who we can be at our best. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next one.